Matthew, a poor black student, stopped by the sidewalk every day to share his meager breakfast with a homeless man huddled on a piece of cardboard. This routine continued until one cold, rainy morning when a wealthy man callously kicked the old man's only blanket into a dirty gutter. Outraged, the student immediately stepped in to confront him, forcing the man to leave amidst the stunned gazes of passers-by. But just a few days later, as the old man's breath grew faint, he suddenly pressed a sealed envelope into Matthew's hand, along with a brief message. From that moment, a truth buried for decades began to resurface in a way no one could have expected. Before we go back, let us know where you're watching from and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Matthew's fingers fumbled with the cardboard pieces as he pressed them into the soles of his sneakers. The worn rubber had given out weeks ago, and now these flimsy inserts were all that stood between his feet and the cold pavement. He sat on the edge of his mattress, no bed frame, just the thin cushion directly on the floor, and pushed the cardboard deeper into the shoes, trying to cover the holes completely. The studio apartment around him told the story of survival stripped to its bones. Water stains bloomed across the ceiling like dark flowers. The single window, cracked in one corner, let in drafts that made the thin curtain dance even when it was closed. His textbooks were stacked against the wall, borrowed from the library, because buying them was out of the question. Next to them sat his work bag, already packed for the day ahead. Matthew glanced at his phone. 5:17 a.m. He'd been awake since 4, going over his midterm notes under the dim light of the lamp he'd found on the street 3 months ago. Anatomy and physiology. The human body required so much to function properly: nutrients, rest, warmth, and here he was rationing all three like they were luxuries instead of necessities. He stood up, testing the cardboard inserts. They'd hold. They had to. In the kitchenette, Matthew pulled out the jar of peanut butter. He held it up to the light, calculating. Maybe a quarter left. The loaf of bread sat next to it, 6 slices remaining. He did the math automatically now, the way other people check the weather. 2 slices for breakfast meant 4 days of lunches if he skipped dinner. Or he could make 3 sandwiches, eat one now, save 2 for later, and deal with tomorrow when it came. His hand moved toward the bread, pulling out 2 slices. Then he stopped. The old man's face flashed in his mind. Yesterday morning, sitting on that cardboard outside the old laundromat. Not the usual vacant stare of someone destroyed by the streets. This man's eyes had been sharp present, watching the world go by, with an awareness that didn't match his situation. Matthew's stomach tightened with hunger. He looked at the bread in his hand, then at the peanut butter jar. "Damn it," he muttered. He pulled out a 3rd slice. The knife scraped against the bottom of the jar as he spread the peanut butter thin across all 3 pieces. He wasn't being generous, he was being stupid. That's what the rational part of his brain said. You can barely feed yourself. You're about to get evicted. You have a midterm in 3 days that you need energy to study for. But the other part of his brain, the part that had watched his mother share her last everything with their neighbors back home, that part won. Matthew wrapped 2 sandwiches in paper towels and put them in his work bag. The 3rd one he ate standing up, forcing himself to chew slowly to make it last. 400 calories maybe, enough to get him through the morning shift at the hospital cafeteria, then the afternoon at the grocery store, then night classes. The math never quite added up, but he made it work. He always made it work. The walk to the bus stop took 20 minutes through neighborhoods that looked worse than his own. March in the city meant a cold that didn't care about your thin jacket or your cardboard shoe inserts. It seeped into your bones and stayed there, a constant companion that reminded you exactly where you stood in the world's hierarchy. Matthew pulled his jacket tighter. The fabric was worn soft, practically see-through at the elbows. He'd bought it at Goodwill 2 years ago, and it had been used then. Now it was barely functional, but it was all he had. The streets were mostly empty at this hour. A few other early risers headed to jobs that started before the sun came up. Nobody made eye contact. That was the rule. In this part of town, you kept your head down. You minded your business. You survived. The laundromat came into view, its windows dark and grimy. And there, on the same piece of cardboard as yesterday, sat the old man. Matthew slowed his pace. In the weak streetlight, he could see more details now. The man wasn't as old as he'd first thought, maybe late 60s, early 70s. His clothes were worn but not filthy. His gray hair, though long, wasn't matted, and those eyes, when they lifted to meet Matthew's, held something Matthew hadn't expected. Recognition. Matthew, quote, "'s feet stopped moving. His hand went to the strap of his bag where the sandwiches were. The old man didn't speak, didn't hold out his hand, didn't perform any of the usual rituals of asking. He just watched Matthew with a gaze that felt like it could see straight through all the excuses Matthew was already forming in his head. Matthew reached into his bag. His fingers found the paper towel bundle. He pulled out one of the sandwiches and took a step forward. Matthew's voice came out rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat. "I made too much. Would you help me out by taking this hate to waste it?" The old man's eyes dropped to the sandwich, then back to Matthew's face. A long moment passed. Matthew felt his cheeks grow warm despite the cold. This was stupid. The man probably thought he was being condescending. Who makes too much of a peanut butter sandwich? But then the old man reached up, his movements slow but steady, and took the offering. "Thank you, Matthew." Matthew's entire body went still. The man's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. He lifted one weathered hand and pointed at Matthew's work bag where his hospital ID badge hung from the strap, his name printed clearly, Matthew Chen. "Oh." Matthew let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "Right, the name tag. Preston." The old man said, his voice gravelly but strong. "Preston Fletcher." He extended his hand and Matthew shook it automatically. The grip was firm, the handshake of someone who'd done it thousands of times in circumstances that mattered. "Nice to meet you, sir," Matthew said, and meant it. Preston nodded once, a sharp military gesture that seemed out of place coming from a man sitting on cardboard at dawn. "You're going to be late for your bus." Matthew checked his phone. 5:51 a.m. The number 47 would arrive in 4 minutes, and he still had 2 blocks to go. Matthew took a step back. "I should go." "Go on then." Preston settled back against the laundromat wall, the sandwich resting carefully on his lap. "Thank you for the meal." Matthew turned and started walking quickly toward the bus stop, but something made him glance back over his shoulder. Preston hadn't torn into the sandwich like a starving man. Instead, he was unwrapping it slowly, methodically, with the kind of care that spoke of discipline, of dignity. Even sitting on cardboard in front of a closed laundromat at 6 in the morning, Preston Fletcher held himself like he mattered, like he'd once been someone. Matthew made it to the bus stop, just as the 47 pulled up its brakes, hissing in the cold air. He climbed aboard, swiped his card, and found a seat by the window. As the bus pulled away, Matthew looked back toward the laundromat. In the growing dawn light, he could see Preston eating the sandwich in small, measured bites. Not rushed, not desperate. Just a man having breakfast, maintaining whatever pieces of himself the streets hadn't taken yet. Matthew leaned his head against the window, the glass cold against his temple. His stomach reminded him that he'd just given away a third of his food for the day. His logical brain reminded him that he couldn't afford kindness when he was barely surviving himself. But watching Preston eat that sandwich with such careful dignity, Matthew felt something he hadn't felt in months. He felt less alone. The bus rolled through the waking city, carrying Matthew toward another day of exhausting loops, study work, eat, sleep, repeat. But now there was something new in the pattern. A name, a handshake, a moment of human connection in a city that usually felt like it was made of concrete and indifference. Preston Fletcher. Matthew closed his eyes and wondered who the old man had been before the streets claimed him. Wondered what kind of life led a man with such bearing to end up on cardboard outside a laundromat. He didn't know it yet, but those questions would change everything. 3 weeks changed the shape of Matthew's mornings. The cardboard was still there outside the laundromat, and so was Preston. But now Matthew stopped every day, and now he came prepared. The thermos had cost him $8 at the dollar store, money he couldn't afford to spend, but did anyway. He filled it each morning with black coffee from the cheap grounds he bought in bulk. No sugar, no cream, just coffee, bitter and hot. Preston took the thermos from Matthew's hands on a Thursday morning, unscrewed the lid, and breathed in the steam. "This is better than what we drank in Kosovo," he said. Matthew settled down on the curb across from Preston's cardboard, his own coffee cooling in a chipped mug. "You were in Kosovo. 1999. Preston took a slow sip, his eyes distant. "We flew supplies into places that didn't exist on any map. Helicopter crews don't ask questions when you're loading boxes marked with clearance codes they've never seen before." Matthew nodded, not sure what to say. Preston spoke like someone reciting facts, not spinning tales. His voice held the flat certainty of a man who'd been there. The coffee came in these green packets. Instant. Tasted like dirt mixed with motor oil. Preston's mouth twitched. But when you're flying over territory where half the people below want to shoot you down, you drink it anyway. "What were you doing there?" Matthew asked. Preston's gaze shifted to him, sharp and assessing. "Moving people who couldn't afford to be seen. Politicians, intelligence assets, people whose faces ending up on the wrong cameras would start wars." He took another sip. "The kind of work that doesn't make it into history books." Matthew listened, watching Preston's weathered hands cradle the thermos. The man's posture hadn't changed in 3 weeks, still straight-backed, still careful with his movements. Nothing about him suggested delusion or the scrambled thinking of someone broken by the streets. But the stories. God, the stories. "We'd land in clearings that weren't on flight plans," Preston continued. 3 minutes on the ground max. Rotors never stopped turning. You'd watch these men in suits sprint from the tree line, faces covered, and you'd get them airborne before anyone knew they'd been there. Matthew sipped his coffee and thought, maybe he really was military. Maybe he really did fly in helicopters. But the rest of it, the secret missions, the VIPs, the cloak and dagger stuff, that's what happens when trauma rewrites your memories. You take the real parts and build them into something bigger, something heroic, because the truth of what broke you is too hard to carry. "Sounds intense," Matthew said carefully. Preston's eyes met his, and for a moment, Matthew felt like the old man could read every doubtful thought in his head. "It was a lifetime ago," Preston said. He handed the thermos back. "You'll be late." Matthew stood brushing off his pants. "Same time tomorrow." "I'll be here." The bus ride to the hospital gave Matthew time to think. Preston's stories were too detailed to be complete fabrications, but too cinematic to be entirely true. The military part made sense. Plenty of veterans ended up on the streets destroyed by what they'd seen or done. But the spy movie elements that felt like a mind trying to make meaning out of chaos. Still, Matthew kept coming back. Kept bringing the coffee, kept listening. At St. Vincent's Hospital, Matthew pushed through the staff entrance and headed to the cafeteria kitchen. The breakfast shift meant serving food to doctors and nurses who didn't see him, to patients who treated him like furniture. "Matthew," Mrs. Carter's voice cut through the clatter of trays. She stood by the coffee station, arms crossed, her supervisor badge catching the fluorescent light. "You look exhausted." "I'm fine, Mrs. Carter." "You're not fine. You've got dark circles under your eyes that weren't there last month." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Are you sleeping?" "Enough," Matthew lied. The truth was more complicated. Between the hospital cafeteria shifts, the afternoon stocking job at Morrison's Grocery, and night classes at Metro Community College, sleep came in stolen fragments. 3 hours here, 2 hours there, occasionally a full 4 if he was lucky. Mrs. Carter studied his face. "The hospital has an employee assistance program, if money's tight." "I'm managing." Matthew grabbed a serving tray. "Just midterms coming up. You know how it is." She didn't know how it was. Nobody here did. They saw the tired college kid who served their eggs and toast, but they didn't see the grocery calculations, the cardboard in the shoes, the constant arithmetic of survival. What they definitely didn't see was Matthew pocketing his lunch money to buy bananas and apples. He did it during his afternoon break, slipping into the hospital cafeteria when it was nearly empty. 2 bananas, 3 apples. He paid with the $5 he should have used to eat, then tucked them into his bag next to his anatomy textbook. Preston needed the vitamins more than Matthew needed hot food. That was the logic anyway. By the time Matthew's shift at Morrison's Grocery ended at 8 p.m., his body moved on autopilot. Scan items, bag them, smile at customers who didn't smile back, repeat. His feet ached. The cardboard inserts had compressed into thin wafers that barely helped anymore. The night bus to Metro Community College was half empty. Matthew took his usual seat in the back, pulled out his anatomy and physiology textbook, and tried to focus. The musculoskeletal system. Bones and muscles working together to create movement. The body as a machine that required precise calibration to function. His eyes kept losing focus on the diagrams. The bus's overhead lights flickered dim and yellow. Around him, other night students dozed or stared at their phones. Matthew forced himself to read the same paragraph 3 times before the words stuck. The human skeletal system consists of 206 bones in adults. His head dipped forward. He jerked awake, heart pounding. Can't sleep. Not yet. The midterm was in 2 days, and he was barely keeping up as it was. Working full-time while attending nursing school part-time was supposed to be doable. Everyone said so, but everyone who said so wasn't living it. Matthew read until his stop, then walked the 6 blocks to the college, then sat through 3 hours of lecture on patient care protocols. By the time he made it back to his studio apartment, it was past midnight. He ate a peanut butter sandwich standing at the counter, too tired to sit. Then he studied for another hour before his eyes refused to stay open. 5:17 a.m. came too soon, but Matthew filled the thermos anyway, made the sandwiches, added the fruit to his bag. Preston was waiting. "You brought breakfast," Preston observed as Matthew handed over a banana and an apple along with the coffee. "Had extra," Matthew said. Preston peeled the banana slowly. "How are your classes going?" Matthew blinked. "I didn't tell you I was in school." "Your bag." Preston gestured with the half-peeled banana. "Metro Community College logo. And you've got the look of someone burning the candle at both ends and the middle." Matthew sat down on the curb. "Nursing program. It's a lot." "I imagine it is." Preston bit into the banana, chewed thoughtfully. "The world needs people who know how to take care of others. People like you, Matthew." Something in his tone made Matthew look up. Preston wasn't offering empty encouragement. He spoke with the weight of someone who'd seen what happened when care was absent, when people fell through the cracks. "Sometimes I'm not sure I'm cut out for it," Matthew admitted. The words surprised him. He hadn't meant to be that honest. Preston finished the banana, folded the peel carefully, and tucked it into a plastic bag he kept for trash. Everything he did had that same deliberate quality, as if chaos could be held at bay through sheer discipline. "You want to know what I learned in 30 years of service?" Preston asked. "What kind of service?" Preston smiled, a thin expression that didn't reach his eyes. "The kind with 3-letter acronyms, CIA, DIA, organizations that don't confirm or deny your employment even after you're long gone." Matthew's skepticism must have shown on his face because Preston's smile widened slightly. "You don't believe me." "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." Preston unscrewed the thermos and took another sip of coffee. "Smart kid like you're thinking old homeless man with delusions of grandeur. Probably was military once, but the PTSD scrambled his brain, and now he thinks he was James Bond." Matthew felt his cheeks grow hot. "I wasn't. It's fine. It's logical." Preston set down the thermos. "But here's what you need to understand about people in power, Matthew. They never forget faces. Once you're in their world, once you see what really happens behind the curtains, you're marked. Either you're useful or you're dangerous." "And which were you?" "Both. Until I wasn't." Preston's expression hardened. "Then they made sure I disappeared in a way that wouldn't raise questions." The words hung in the cold morning air. Matthew wanted to dismiss them as paranoid fantasy, but something in Preston's eyes stopped him. Not madness, not confusion, just a bone-deep weariness that came from knowing too much. "I should get to my bus," Matthew said quietly. Preston nodded. "Thank you for the coffee. And the fruit." Matthew stood shouldering his bag. "Preston, yes. Even if I don't understand all of it, I'm glad you're telling me." Preston looked at him for a long moment. "Be careful, Matthew. Kindness makes you visible, and visible people get noticed." The warning followed Matthew onto the bus, through his shifts into his classroom. He couldn't shake the feeling that Preston wasn't spinning tales. He was issuing a warning. The warning stayed with Matthew, but life didn't slow down to let him process it. The next morning came with rain-cold, miserable rain that turned the city streets into rivers of gray water and made the walk to the bus stop feel twice as long. Matthew's shoes were soaked through by the time he reached the laundromat. The cardboard inserts had turned to mush. He could feel every crack in the sidewalk through the worn soles. Preston was huddled against the building wall, his usual blanket pulled tight around his shoulders. It was wool-thin and moth-eaten, but it was all he had. The cardboard beneath him had started to disintegrate in the wet. Matthew was 10 feet away when he saw the man in the suit. Expensive suit, the kind that cost more than Matthew's rent. Charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes, tailored perfectly to the man's frame. He was talking on his phone, gesturing with his free hand, not watching where he was going. His polished leather shoe caught the edge of Preston's blanket. The man stumbled, caught himself, and looked down with the expression of someone who'd stepped in dog shit. "Move your crap." He snapped, phone still pressed to his ear. Preston started to shift, gathering his blanket, but he wasn't fast enough. The man's foot lashed out, kicking the blanket hard. It flew off Preston's shoulders and landed directly in the gutter where rainwater mixed with oil and trash flowed toward the storm drain. "Jesus Christ, you people are everywhere." the man muttered, already turning away, already dismissing Preston as less than human. Something in Matthew's chest ignited. He didn't think. His body moved before his brain caught up. 3 strides brought him face to face with the businessman, and Matthew's hand shot out, gripping the man's shoulder hard enough to spin him around. "What the hell?" The man jerked back, phone dropping from his ear. "Pick it up," Matthew said. "Excuse me." "The blanket." "Pick it up." The businessman's eyes traveled from Matthew's face down to his soaked shoes and back up. His lip curled. "Get your hands off me." Matthew didn't let go. "That's someone's only blanket you just threw in the gutter. Pick it up." "I'm not touching that filthy thing." The man tried to pull away, but Matthew's grip tightened. "Let go of me before I call the cops." "Call them. I'll wait." Matthew felt the rage building hot and clean. "I'll explain how you assaulted a homeless veteran." "Assaulted?" The man's voice rose. "I kicked a blanket that was in my way. Maybe your friend there should camp somewhere that's not in the middle of the sidewalk." Matthew stepped closer. The businessman was taller, broader, but he stepped back anyway. "That's somebody's grandfather," Matthew said, his voice low and hard. "That's somebody's father. That's a human being who deserves basic respect. And you're just a coward in designer clothes." The man's face flushed red. His eyes flicked to Matthew's dark skin, then to Preston's disheveled appearance, and his expression twisted into something uglier. "I see what this is," he said. "You people always stick together, don't you, playing the victim, making everything about race." Matthew's hand moved from the man's shoulder to the front of his shirt, bunching the expensive fabric in his fist. "Matthew!" Preston's voice cut through the rain. "Matthew, let him go." "Not until he apologizes." "Let him go," Preston repeated, and there was something in his tone that made Matthew's grip loosen despite himself. The businessman yanked free, stumbling backward. "You're both insane. This is assault. I should press charges." "Then do it," Matthew said. "I'll be right here." The man smoothed his shirt, his phone clutched in one white-knuckled hand. For a moment, Matthew thought he actually would call the police. But then the businessman looked at the few early-morning pedestrians who'd stopped to watch, looked at Matthew's defiant stance, and seemed to calculate the cost of making a scene. "Not worth my time," he muttered, and walked away, quickly, phone already back to his ear. Matthew stood in the rain, breathing hard, watching the man disappear around the corner. "Matthew." He turned. Preston was still sitting against the wall, watching him with an unreadable expression. "Sorry," Matthew said. That was wrong. What he did was wrong." "It was." Preston's voice was quiet. "But starting a fight in the street isn't going to change men like that." Matthew walked to the gutter and pulled out Preston's blanket. It was soaked heavy with dirty water. He wrung it out as best he could, but it was ruined. The wool had absorbed oil and grime that no amount of squeezing would remove. "I'm sorry," Matthew said again. "Your blanket? It's just a blanket." Preston accepted it anyway, draping it over his cardboard. "I've slept in worse conditions." Matthew crouched down to Preston's level. The old man's eyes were calm, but there was something else there too. Pride, maybe, or recognition. "You've got a fighter's spirit," Preston said. "That's good. You're going to need it." "Need it for what?" Preston smiled, that sad smile that never quite reached his eyes. "For whatever comes next. People like us, Matthew, we don't get to walk away from fights. They find us whether we want them or not." Matthew wanted to argue, to say that he wasn't looking for fights, that he just wanted to finish school and get a decent job, and maybe stop worrying about where his next meal was coming from. But the words stuck in his throat, because part of him knew Preston was right. The bus pulled up. Matthew stood reluctantly. "I'll bring you another blanket," he said. "Don't. You can barely afford to feed yourself." Matthew opened his mouth to deny it, but Preston held up a hand. "I see you, Matthew. The way you move, the way you measure everything. I know what hunger looks like." Preston adjusted the wet blanket around his shoulders. "Take care of yourself first." Matthew nodded, not trusting his voice, and got on the bus. The day crawled by in a haze of exhaustion and simmering anger. At the hospital cafeteria, he served eggs and toast with mechanical efficiency. At Morrison's grocery, he scanned items and bagged them without really seeing them. His mind kept replaying the businessman's sneer, the casual cruelty of kicking someone's only warmth into the gutter. By the time Matthew got home that night, his body felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He pushed open the door to his studio and froze. A notice was taped to the wall beside the doorframe. Bright yellow paper, impossible to miss. Final notice, eviction warning. Matthew ripped it down and read it standing in the doorway. 2 weeks of unpaid rent. Pay within 5 days or face eviction proceedings. The amount due glared at him from the bottom of the page, $1.240. He'd known it was coming. He'd been dodging his landlord's calls for a week, but seeing it in writing made it real in a way that turned his stomach cold. Matthew walked to the kitchenette and opened the cabinet. The peanut butter jar was nearly empty, maybe enough for 2 sandwiches if he scraped the sides. Half a loaf of bread, 3 eggs, a mostly empty bag of rice. He did the math automatically. The money he had left from this week's paychecks, $180. Rent, $1.240. The gap between those numbers was a canyon he couldn't cross. Matthew could skip meals. He could skip a lot of things, but he couldn't skip rent and still have a roof over his head. He sat down on the mattress, the eviction notice still in his hand, and stared at the peanut butter jar. If he didn't eat dinner tonight, he'd have enough to make 2 sandwiches tomorrow. One for him, one for Preston. The thought settled in his mind with a strange kind of clarity. His stomach was already growling, already cramping with hunger, but Preston needed to eat too. Matthew stood up, walked to the sink, and drank 2 full glasses of water. It wouldn't stop the hunger, but it would dull it enough to sleep. Tomorrow morning came too early, but Matthew made the sandwiches anyway. His hands shook slightly as he scraped the last of the peanut butter from the jar. He wrapped both sandwiches in paper towels and put them in his bag. The walk to the bus stop felt longer than usual. His body moved sluggishly, protesting the lack of fuel, but he kept walking. Preston was there, the ruined blanket draped over his cardboard. He looked up as Matthew approached, and his eyes went immediately to Matthew's face. "You didn't eat yesterday," Preston said. Not a question. "I ate." "Don't lie to me, son." Preston's voice was gentle but firm. "You've got the look." Matthew sat down on the curb and pulled out the sandwiches. "I made breakfast." Preston took the sandwich Matthew offered, but didn't unwrap it. Instead, he studied Matthew's face for a long moment. Then he broke the sandwich in half. "What are you doing?" Matthew asked. Preston held out one half to Matthew. "Fair is fair. You eat, kid, or I'm not taking any of it." "Preston, I made that for you, and I'm sharing it with you. That's how this works." Preston's expression was firm. "You take care of me, I take care of you. That's what people do." Matthew's throat tightened. He took the half sandwich with shaking hands. They sat there on the dirty sidewalk as the city woke up around them, a young black nursing student and an old homeless veteran sharing a peanut butter sandwich in the gray morning light. 2 men who had nothing, giving each other everything they could. Matthew bit into his half and felt tears prick his eyes, not from sadness, from the overwhelming weight of being seen, of being cared for, of not being alone. Preston ate his half slowly with that same careful dignity he brought to everything. "You're going to make it, Matthew," he said quietly. "I don't know how yet, but you will. People like us, we survive." Matthew nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The sandwich tasted like hope. The next morning, the cardboard was empty. Matthew stood in front of the laundromat thermos in one hand, sandwich in the other, staring at the spot where Preston should have been. The cardboard was still there, weighted down with a rock to keep it from blowing away, but no blanket, no Preston. Matthew's chest tightened. He walked the length of the block, checking doorways and alcoves. Nothing. He crossed the street and checked the bus shelter. Empty. The alley behind the laundromat, just dumpsters and broken bottles. "Excuse me." Matthew approached an older woman waiting at the bus stop. "Have you seen the man who usually sits here, gray hair, military bearing?" She shook her head without looking up from her phone. Matthew asked 3 more people. Nobody had seen anything. He got on the bus when it came, but his mind wasn't on work. It was on the businessman from yesterday, on his cruel sneer, on the way he'd looked at Preston like he was trash to be disposed of. What if he'd come back? What if he'd done something worse when Matthew wasn't there to intervene? The day dragged. At the hospital cafeteria, Matthew burned himself on the coffee machine because he wasn't paying attention. At Morrison's grocery, he had to recount his register twice because the numbers didn't match. "You okay?" his supervisor asked. "Fine," Matthew lied. That evening, instead of going to class, Matthew took the bus back to the laundromat. The cardboard was still there, still empty. He walked 6 blocks in each direction, checking every overpass, every sheltered spot where someone might sleep. The city was full of homeless people, but none of them were Preston. As night fell, Matthew stood at the intersection near the laundromat and felt fear settle deep in his bones. Preston had been there every single morning for 5 weeks. Rain or shine, he'd been there. Something was wrong, Dot. The next day, Matthew called in sick to the hospital. He couldn't afford to miss work, but he couldn't focus anyway. Instead, he took the bus downtown to the Mercy Street shelter. The building was concrete and institutional, painted a beige that had probably been depressing when it was new. Matthew pushed through the doors and approached the front desk. "I'm looking for someone," he said to the woman behind the plexiglass. "Preston Fletcher. He's a veteran, late 60s, gray hair." "We don't give out information on residents," the woman said without looking up from her computer. "I'm not asking for his information. I just need to know if he's here, if he's safe." "Can't help you." Matthew's hands clenched on the counter edge. "Please, he's been missing for 2 days. I just need to know if he checked in here." The woman finally looked at him, her expression flat, with the exhaustion of someone who'd heard every plea, every story, every desperate request. "We have privacy policies. If your friend wants you to know where he is, he'll tell you himself." "He's not my friend, he's—" Matthew stopped. What was Preston to him? He's someone I care about. And I'm worried something happened to him. Something happens to all of them eventually? The woman turned back to her computer. "Next." Matthew didn't move. "Could you at least check your intake records? Just tell me yes or no if Preston Fletcher has been here in the last week." I said next. A security guard stepped forward. Matthew raised his hands and stepped back. The Coalition for the Homeless had a different receptionist but the same policy. So did the St. Francis Day Center. So did every other shelter and outreach program Matthew found in his frantic afternoon of searching. Nobody would tell him anything. Preston Fletcher was just a name in their database, if he was in there at all. A number, a statistic, not a man who drank his coffee slowly and spoke about Kosovo and shared his last sandwich even when he was starving. By the time Matthew made it to his evening class, he'd missed the midterm. His phone had 3 missed calls from his anatomy professor. He sat in the back of the lecture hall staring at nothing and thought about how the system was designed to make people disappear. Day 3, day 4. The cardboard remained empty. Matthew went through the motions. Work, search, sleep, repeat. The eviction notice on his wall seemed less important now. What did it matter if he lost his apartment when Preston might be lying, hurt somewhere, or worse? On the 5th morning, Matthew arrived at the laundromat with no real hope. He'd already started composing the goodbye in his head, the acknowledgement that Preston was gone, and he'd never know what happened. Then he saw the figure on the cardboard dot. Matthew ran the last 20 feet. Preston was there, but wrong. His skin had a grayish pallor that hadn't been there before. He sat slumped against the wall, the ruined blanket wrapped around him, and his breathing looked labored. "Preston." Matthew dropped to his knees. "Jesus, where have you been? Are you okay?" Preston's eyes opened slowly. "Matthew, I've been looking everywhere for you. I thought—" Matthew's voice cracked. "I thought something happened." "Something did." Preston's voice was barely above a whisper. Matthew pulled out his phone. "I'm calling an ambulance." "No." Preston's hand shot out with surprising strength, gripping Matthew's wrist. "No hospitals. You need medical attention. You look—" "I'm fine." "You're not fine." Matthew's voice rose. "Where were you? What happened?" Preston was quiet for a long moment. Then he shifted, and Matthew saw it. A fresh scar on the left side of Preston's neck, partially hidden by his collar. It was surgical clean lines, recent sutures, the skin around it still pink and healing. Matthew's medical training kicked in automatically. "That's a neck dissection incision. That's from surgery, Preston. Recent surgery. It's an old wound. Don't lie to me. That's maybe a week-old maximum." Matthew leaned closer. "What kind of surgery did you have?" Preston pulled his collar up, hiding the scar. "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me." They stared at each other. Matthew saw something in Preston's eyes he hadn't seen before. Not the sharp assessment or the quiet dignity, but fear. Real, bone-deep fear. "I don't have much time left," Preston said quietly. The words hit Matthew like a physical blow. "What?" "That's all you need to know." Preston reached into his jacket, moving carefully, and pulled out a white envelope. It was sealed thick with papers inside. An address was written on the front in Preston's careful handwriting, the Pentagon, Washington, D.C. Preston held it out to Matthew. "When my breathing stops," Preston said, "you send this. Not before. After." Matthew took the envelope with shaking hands. "Preston, what is this?" "Insurance. Evidence. The truth." Preston's fingers wrapped around Matthew's, pressing the envelope firmly into his palm. "Promise me, Matthew. When I'm gone, you send this exactly where it says. Don't open it. Don't read it. For your own safety, you don't want to know what's inside until it's already in the right hands. You're talking like you're dying. We're all dying. Some of us just have a clearer timeline. Preston managed a weak smile. Promise me. Matthew's throat felt tight. I promise. Say it properly. I promise I'll send this when… Matthew couldn't finish the sentence. Good. Preston's hand dropped away. Don't try to save me, Matthew. Don't take me to a hospital when the time comes. Just let me go quietly and send that letter. That's all I ask. What's in it? Names, dates, proof of things that were never supposed to be proven. Preston's eyes were heavy-lidded, now exhaustion overtaking him. I spent 30 years keeping secrets for people who thought they could erase me when I became inconvenient. This letter is my middle finger from beyond the grave. Matthew looked down at the envelope. It felt heavier than it should, weighted with more than just paper. This was someone's life contained in a sealed packet, maybe multiple lives. Secrets that Preston had carried alone, that he'd lived on the streets to protect. Why me? Matthew asked. Why are you trusting me with this? Preston's eyes focused on him with sudden clarity. Because you're the only person in 5 years who looked at me and saw a human being. Because you gave me your breakfast when you were hungrier than I was. Because you've got a good heart, Matthew, and that's rarer than you think. He reached out and gripped Matthew's shoulder. Don't let them bury this with me. Don't let them win. Preston's voice was fierce despite his weakness. Promise me you'll fight. Matthew felt tears burn his eyes. I promise. Preston nodded and released his grip. He leaned back against the laundromat wall, closing his eyes. Good. That's good. Matthew sat there on the cold sidewalk, the envelope clutched in both hands. Inside was something that scared Preston, a man who claimed to have flown into war zones, who spoke about intelligence agencies like he'd lived inside them. Whatever was in this envelope was dangerous enough that Preston had warned him not to open it. The weight of it pressed into Matthew's palms. Not just paper, but responsibility. Trust. The final act of a man who'd been erased by the people he'd served. Matthew carefully unzipped his backpack and slipped the envelope into the inner pocket next to his anatomy textbook. It fit there snugly hidden, but present. His bus was coming. Matthew stood reluctantly. I'll be here tomorrow, he said. Preston didn't open his eyes. I know you will. Matthew walked to the bus stop with the envelope burning against his back like a brand. He didn't know what secrets it contained, didn't know what sending it would set in motion. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Preston Fletcher's story wasn't going to end quietly in a gutter forgotten and erased. Matthew would make sure of that. 3 days after Preston gave him the envelope, Matthew arrived at the laundromat with the thermos of coffee and found Preston exactly where he'd been every morning, sitting upright against the wall, watching the city wake up. Morning, Matthew said, unscrewing the thermos lid. Preston reached for it, and his hand trembled. Not the slight shake of cold or age, but a violent tremor that made coffee slosh over the rim. Preston. The old man's eyes rolled back. His body pitched forward, and Matthew barely caught him before his head hit the concrete. Preston's weight was dead weight in Matthew's arms, his breathing suddenly harsh and irregular. Preston, can you hear me? Matthew lowered him flat on the sidewalk, his medical training kicking in automatically. Check airway, check breathing, check circulation. Preston's breathing was labored, rattling in his chest. His lips had a bluish tint. Someone called 911 inches, Matthew shouted at the handful of people walking past. Nobody stopped. A woman glanced over, saw a young black man kneeling over a homeless person, and walked faster. Please, he's having a stroke. Someone call an ambulance. A businessman crossed to the other side of the street. An older couple hurried past without looking. Preston, breathing, stop. Matthew tilted Preston's head back, checked his mouth for obstructions, and started rescue breathing. 2 breaths. Check for chest rise. 2 more breaths. Help, I need help. Matthew's voice cracked as he positioned his hands for chest compressions. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. The rhythm his instructors had drilled into him hard and fast. Don't stop. A teenage kid pulled out his phone, but he was filming, not calling for help. Call 911, not TikTok. Matthew screamed at him between compressions. The kid backed away. Matthew kept going. His arms burned. Sweat dripped into his eyes. Preston's sternum flexed under his palms with each compression, and Matthew prayed he wasn't breaking ribs, even as he knew broken ribs were better than death. 2 breaths, 30 compressions, 2 breaths. A woman finally stopped. "I called. Ambulance is coming." "Thank you," Matthew gasped. "Thank you." He didn't stop compressions until he heard the sirens dot. The paramedics took over with professional efficiency, loading Preston onto a gurney, starting an IV, fitting an oxygen mask over his face. Matthew climbed into the ambulance with them without asking permission. "Family?" one paramedic asked. "Yes," Matthew lied. "He's my uncle." Nobody questioned it. At St. Vincent's Hospital, they wheeled Preston straight into the emergency department. Matthew followed, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline, his shirt soaked with sweat, despite the cold morning. A nurse intercepted him at the double doors. "You'll need to wait here." "I need to stay with him." "Family only beyond this point. We'll update you when we know more." Matthew wanted to argue, but the doors had already swung shut. He stood in the waiting room, breathing hard, Preston's blood on his hands from where he'd checked for a pulse. An hour passed. 2. Matthew sat in a plastic chair and watched the clock dot. Finally, a woman in scrubs approached. Her name tag read Rachel, Patient Services. "You're with Preston Fletcher." Matthew stood. "Yes. Is he okay?" Rachel's expression was carefully neutral. "He's stable for now, but his condition is serious. We're going to need to transfer him to our charity care facility on the south side." "No. Excuse me. He stays here." Matthew's voice was firm. "He gets the best care you have." Rachel's professional smile tightened. "I understand your concern, but without insurance, the costs." "I don't care about costs. He's my uncle, and you're going to save him. Whatever it takes." "Sir, I appreciate your dedication, but our charity facility is perfectly adequate for—" "He's a veteran," Matthew said. "He served this country. He deserves better than adequate." Rachel checked her tablet. "I'm not seeing any VA benefits in his records." "Then look harder." Matthew stepped closer. "His name is Preston Allen Fletcher. He's a veteran. Look in the VA system." "We did. There's no record." "Look again." Matthew's voice rose. Several people in the waiting room turned to stare. "Please, just look again. There has to be something." Rachel's jaw tightened, but something in Matthew's desperation must have gotten through. "I'll see what I can do. Wait here." She disappeared through the double doors. Matthew sat back down, his head in his hands. The envelope in his backpack felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Preston had said, "Don't open it," but Matthew was starting to wonder if whatever was inside could help now, could prove Preston deserved better than being shuffled off to die in the cheapest bed they had. 20 minutes later, the double doors opened and a different person emerged. Indian man, mid-50s, wearing a white coat with a stethoscope around his neck. His name tag read Dr. Anish Patel, attending physician. "Matthew Chen." Matthew jumped to his feet. "That's me." Dr. Patel studied him for a long moment. "Rachel tells me you're very insistent that your uncle stay here for treatment." "Yes, sir." "She also tells me you're certain he's a veteran with VA benefits, despite our initial search showing no records." Matthew met his eyes. "I know what I know." Dr. Patel was quiet for a moment. Then he gestured to the chairs. "Sit with me." They sat. Dr. Patel folded his hands in his lap. "I've been a doctor for 26 years, he said. "I've seen a lot of young people fight for family members, but the way you perform CPR out there," Rachel pulled the paramedic report that was textbook. "You're trained. Nursing student, Metro Community College. And you work here in the cafeteria." Matthew blinked. "How did you—" "I've seen you. I eat lunch at odd hours." Dr. Patel leaned forward. "So I'm going to ask you directly, is Preston Fletcher really your uncle, or are you a nursing student with a good heart who's trying to save a homeless man's life?" Matthew's throat tightened. The lie would get Preston better care. The truth might get Matthew thrown out. "He's not my blood uncle," Matthew said quietly. "But he's family. He's the only family I've got in this city." Dr. Patel nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." He stood. "Come with me." Matthew followed him through the double doors, past nurses and equipment, and the organized chaos of the emergency department to a small office. "Doctor." Patel sat down at a computer and gestured for Matthew to close the door. "The VA system is complicated," Dr. Patel said, typing. "Sometimes records get buried, sometimes they get sealed, and sometimes—" He paused, staring at the screen. "Sometimes they get classified." Matthew leaned over Dr. Patel's shoulder. The screen showed a VA medical record database. At the top, Preston Allen Fletcher, DOB March 15th, 1954. Everything below that was black bars. Classified, classified, classified. Line after line of redacted information. Service dates blacked out. Unit assignments blacked out. Medical history blacked out. 95% of Preston's military record was hidden behind security clearances Dr. Patel didn't have. What the hell? Matthew breathed. Dr. Patel scrolled down. More black bars. The only things visible were Preston's name, date of birth, and a single line at the bottom, veteran status confirmed. Clearance required for further information. I've never seen anything like this, Dr. Patel said quietly. I've treated generals, CIA officers, people with top secret clearances. Their records have redactions, sure, but this, he gestured at the screen. This is someone who was erased. Matthew stared at the black bars, thinking about Preston's stories. The helicopter flights into Kosovo, the 3-letter agencies, the warning about powerful people never forgetting faces. He told the truth, Matthew said. Apparently so. Dr. Patel closed the screen. Your uncle isn't just a veteran, Matthew. He's a ghost in the system. Someone very important wanted him to disappear. But he's here now. Can you help him? Dr. Patel stood. He's in room 347, critical but stable. The stroke was severe, but you got to him in time. The CPR you performed saved his life. Can I see him? He's unconscious. Has been since the ambulance. Dr. Patel put a hand on Matthew's shoulder. I'm going to be honest with you. At his age, with his condition, the prognosis isn't good. Days, maybe. Not weeks. The words hit Matthew like a punch. Days. I'm sorry. The stroke was massive, even if he wakes up the damage. Dr. Patel shook his head. You should prepare yourself. Matthew's vision blurred. Can I sit with him? Of course, as long as you need. Room 347 was small and sterile. Preston lay in the bed tubes running from his arms, monitors beeping steadily. His face was slack, peaceful. He looked smaller than he had on the streets, diminished by the clean white sheets and the machinery keeping him alive. Matthew pulled a chair next to the bed and sat down. I'm here, he said quietly. I'm not leaving. Preston didn't respond. The ventilator hissed. The heart monitor beeped. Matthew stayed. Hours blurred together. Nurses came and went, checking vitals, adjusting medications. Matthew ignored his phone when it buzzed with texts from work, from school. None of that mattered. Night fell. Matthew's backpack sat at his feet, the envelope inside pressing against his consciousness like a weight. 48 hours. Matthew left only to use the bathroom to splash water on his face. A kind nurse brought him coffee and a sandwich from the cafeteria. Matthew ate without tasting it. On the second night, Preston's eyes opened. Matthew jerked awake in his chair, not realizing he'd dozed off. Preston. Preston's hand moved weakly, reaching. Matthew grabbed it, squeezing tight. Preston, S eyes found Matthew's face. His mouth moved, but the ventilator tube prevented speech. Don't try to talk, Matthew said. Just rest. I'm here. But Preston kept trying, his eyes urgent. His free hand lifted trembling and pointed at Matthew's backpack. Matthew, breath caught. The envelope. Preston's grip tightened slightly. His eyes held Matthew's, and in them was everything he couldn't say. Remember, keep your promise, fight. I remember, Matthew whispered. I'll send it. I promise. Preston's hand moved to Matthew's, squeezing once. Then his eyes drifted closed. The monitors started screaming. Nurses rushed in. Dr. Patel appeared, calling orders. Matthew was pushed back against the wall as they worked, trying to restart Preston's heart, trying to bring him back. But Matthew knew. He could see it in the flat line on the monitor, in the slowing movements of the medical team, in Dr. Patel's face when he finally stepped back. Time of death, 9:47 p.m. The room went quiet, except for the single sustained tone of the heart monitor. Matthew stood against the wall, Preston's final grip still phantom warm on his hand. The nurses began disconnecting equipment with practiced efficiency, moving around Matthew like he was furniture. Dr. Patel approached. I'm very sorry. Matthew couldn't speak, couldn't move. He stared at Preston's still face, at the man who'd shared his breakfast, who'd warned him about powerful people who'd trusted him with secrets. Matthew still didn't understand. The only family he had in this city was gone. Dr. Patel touched his shoulder gently. Take your time. We'll need to discuss arrangements, but there's no rush. Matthew nodded numbly. When the room finally emptied, Matthew walked to the bed. He reached out and closed Preston's eyes the way he'd been taught in nursing school. I won't let you down, he whispered. Then he picked up his backpack, unzipped the inner pocket, and pulled out the white envelope. The address stared back at him. The Pentagon, Washington, D.C. Matthew looked at Preston one last time, then at the envelope in his hands. Whatever was inside this, whatever secrets Preston had died protecting, they were about to come to light. Matthew walked out of room 347 with the envelope clutched tight and the weight of a promise that would change everything. The post office on 5th Street opened at 9 a.m. Matthew was there at 8:30, the white envelope in his hands, counting the change in his pocket for the third time. Certified mail to Washington, D.C. cost $8.73. Matthew had $9.42 left to his name. The clerk barely looked at him as she weighed the envelope, printed the label, and handed him the receipt. Matthew watched her place it in the outgoing mail bin. The promise was kept. He walked back to St. Vincent's Hospital in a daze. The world felt emptier now. He pushed through the staff entrance and clocked in for his cafeteria shift. Scrambled eggs, toast, coffee. Serve, smile, repeat. Matthew. Mrs. Carter appeared beside him during lunch rush. I heard about your uncle. I'm so sorry. Matthew nodded, not trusting his voice. Take a few days if you need to. I need the hours. The day dragged. Matthew served food, cleaned tables, wiped counters. His studio apartment waited that evening, with its eviction notice and empty cabinets. He sat on his mattress and stared at the wall until exhaustion pulled him under. 7 days after he mailed the envelope, someone knocked on his door. Matthew opened it to find 3 men in military dress uniforms. The one in front had silver eagles on his shoulders, a colonel. The 2 behind him stood at parade rest. Matthew Chen, the colonel asked. Matthew's stomach dropped. They'd found out he lied about being Preston's nephew. They were here to arrest him. Yes, sir. Colonel David Hayes, United States Army. We need you to come with us. Am I in trouble? No. But we need to speak with you regarding Preston Fletcher. May we come in? Matthew stepped back. The 3 men filled his tiny studio. Colonel Hayes glanced around at the mattress on the floor, the eviction notice, the empty kitchenette, and his expression didn't change. Pack a bag, Hayes said. You're coming to Washington. What? Why? General Ashford wants to speak with you personally. We have a plane waiting. Matthew's mind reeled. I have work. I have class. This isn't optional, Mr. Chen. You sent a letter to the Pentagon containing classified information. That makes you a person of interest. Hayes gestured to the door. Pack enough for 2 days. Matthew grabbed his backpack and stuffed in clean clothes, his phone charger, his anatomy textbook. The 2 junior officers escorted him downstairs while Hayes followed. The entire apartment complex had gathered to watch. Mrs. Rodriguez clutched her rosary. The teenagers filmed on their phones. Matthew caught whispers, always knew that kid was trouble, and probably dealing drugs. A black SUV waited at the curb. Matthew climbed into the back seat between the 2 officers while Hayes took the front. They drove to a small airfield outside the city. Matthew had never been on a plane before. The aircraft waiting wasn't commercial. It was military, sleek, and unmarked. Hayes led him up the stairs into a cabin fitted with leather seats that looked more expensive than Matthew's entire apartment. Sit anywhere, Hayes said. Matthew took the seat closest to the door, backpack clutched on his lap. Hayes disappeared into the cockpit. The engines roared. Matthew's hands gripped the armrests as the plane accelerated and lifted into the air. He spent 22 years looking up at planes crossing the sky, wondering where they were going. Now he was inside one, watching his city shrink below into a grid of streets and buildings. The ground fell away. Clouds rushed past the window. Matthew had never seen the world from up here. One of the officers leaned forward. First time flying, Matthew nodded. It gets easier. The flight took less than 2 hours. Matthew spent it staring out the window, watching the landscape change below. Cities gave way to farmland to forests to the sprawl of the capital. They landed at Joint Base Andrews. Another SUV was waiting. The drive into Arlington passed in a blur of monuments and government buildings. The SUV pulled up to a hotel, the Ritz-Carlton. You're staying here tonight, Hayes said. Rooms already booked. Don't leave the hotel. Someone will collect you at 0700 tomorrow. Matthew walked into a lobby of polished marble and crystal chandeliers. A concierge handed him a key card without blinking at his worn clothes. The elevator played soft classical music. The room was bigger than his studio apartment. King-sized bed with crisp white linens, marble bathroom, a couch, an armchair in front of floor-to-ceiling windows. Matthew stood in the doorway, afraid to touch anything. The carpet was too clean for his shoes, the furniture too pristine to sit on. He took off his sneakers, the cardboard inserts had disintegrated completely, and walked barefoot to the window. Washington sprawled below, lit up against the evening sky. Matthew barely slept. He showered in a bathroom with actual water pressure, ate the room service breakfast that appeared at his door, and was waiting in the lobby at 6:45 when Hayes arrived. "Ready?" Hayes asked. The Pentagon was massive. Matthew had seen pictures, but they didn't capture the sheer scale. 5 concentric rings of gray concrete housing American military power. Hayes led him through security checkpoints where guards examined his ID 3 times. They walked down corridors that seemed endless, past offices where people in uniform moved with purpose. Finally, Hayes stopped at a door marked Office of the Deputy Chief of Staff, Intelligence. He knocked and opened it. The office was large, but not ostentatious. An American flag stood in one corner. Framed photos lined the walls, military operations, official ceremonies. Behind the desk sat a woman in her late 50s, wearing army dress blues with 2 stars on her shoulders. Gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Sharp, assessing eyes. "General Ashford," Hayes said. "Matthew Chen." General Victoria Ashford stood and came around the desk. She was shorter than Matthew expected, but she carried herself with authority that made the room feel smaller. "Mr. Chen, please sit." Matthew sat. Hayes left, closing the door. Ashford returned to her seat and folded her hands on the desk. "I'm going to be direct with you, Matthew. The letter you sent confirmed something we've suspected for 23 years, but could never prove. Preston Fletcher saved my life in 2001 along with 2 sitting senators, and then we erased him from existence to protect a political agenda." Matthew's throat was dry. He told me he worked for 3-letter agencies. CIA, DIA, NSA. Preston worked for all of them. He was one of the best field operatives we ever had. Ashford's jaw tightened. In August 2001, he was assigned to protect a diplomatic convoy in the Balkans. Intelligence indicated a credible assassination threat against myself and 2 senators. She stood and walked to the window. Preston identified the threat: local militia with outside backing. He diverted our route, called in air support, personally extracted us under fire. 3 men died, all enemy combatants. Preston got us out without a scratch. Then why erase him? Matthew's voice came out harder than intended. Ashford turned, because one of those senators was taking bribes from the very people who'd ordered the hit. If Preston's report went public, it would have exposed a sitting member of Congress as complicit in attempted assassination. So they classified everything at the highest level, sealed Preston's records, and reassigned him to a black site in Eastern Europe where he couldn't talk. She returned to her desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a photograph. When Preston came home in 2007, they retired him with a pension that never materialized. His medical benefits vanished. His service record became a ghost file. Ashford slid the photograph across. He sent this with his letter. "I think he wanted you to know who he was before everything fell apart." Matthew picked up the photo. It showed a younger Preston in full dress uniform standing at attention. His face unlined, his eyes bright. On the back, in Preston's careful handwriting, "Remember this young man. His name is Matthew Chen. He gave me my dignity when the world had taken everything else. Give him his future." Matthew's vision blurred. His hands shook, holding the photo. "Preston didn't ask for justice for himself," Ashford said quietly. "His letter was 40 pages documenting what happened to him, but the last page was about you, your kindness, your sacrifices, your dreams of becoming a nurse." She leaned forward. "He didn't want revenge, Matthew. He wanted to make sure you got a chance he never did." Matthew couldn't speak. Tears ran down his face. Ashford, quote-s voice was gentle now. "Preston Fletcher's final act of service was saving you, and I'm going to honor that." 3 days after meeting General Ashford, Matthew found himself in a conference room with 4 people in expensive suits who introduced themselves as advisors from the Senate Armed Services Committee. "The hearing is tomorrow," the lead advisor said, a woman named Patricia Reynolds. "We need to prepare you for what to expect." Matthew sat at the table, still feeling out of place in the borrowed suit they'd given him. It fit badly, too loose in the shoulders, too long in the sleeves. "We've prepared a statement for you to read." Reynolds continued sliding a document across the table. "It focuses on Preston's service record and the injustice of his treatment. Keep it factual, keep it emotional. The committee responds well to personal stories." Matthew scanned the first page. The words were polished, professional, completely empty. "And regarding your appearance," another advisor said, "we think it would be more effective if you wore something that reflects your actual circumstances. The committee needs to see you as you really are, struggling authentic. It builds sympathy." Matthew looked up. "You want me to dress poor? We want you to dress honestly." "I am dressing honestly. This is the best I have." Reynolds leaned forward. "Matthew, we're trying to help you. This hearing could change your life. But you need to play this right. These senators have seen 1,000 people testify. You need to stand out, and authenticity is how you do that." Matthew pushed the prepared statement back across the table. "I'm not reading this." "Excuse me. This isn't Preston's story. This is some polished version you made up to make them feel guilty." Matthew stood. "I'll tell them what happened, in my own words." Reynolds's expression hardened. "That's a mistake. You're a nursing student, not a public speaker. Without preparation, you could say the wrong thing. Hurt the case." "Then I'll hurt the case." Matthew walked to the door. "But I'm not going to lie about who Preston was to make it easier for them to swallow." The next morning, Matthew woke in his hotel room at 5 a.m. out of habit. He showered, put on his own clothes, the cleanest white shirt he owned, the pants that weren't quite long enough, his worn sneakers because they were all he had. He picked up Preston's notebook, the one the old man had sometimes written in during their morning conversations, and tucked it into his pocket. Colonel Hayes met him in the lobby at 7. "You ready for this?" Hayes asked. "No," Matthew said honestly. The Hart Senate office building was all marble and authority. Hayes led Matthew through security and down corridors where senators and staffers moved with purpose. They stopped outside a massive wooden door with brass handles. "Senate Armed Services Committee," Hayes said. "General Ashford will be testifying first, establishing the facts. Then you. Just tell the truth." Hayes opened the door. The hearing room was bigger than Matthew had imagined, rows of seats for observers already filling with journalists and military personnel. At the front, a raised bench where senators sat like judges. Cameras lined the walls, their red recording lights already glowing. Matthew took his seat at the witness table, a microphone in front of him, a pitcher of water he was too nervous to drink from. General Ashford testified for 40 minutes, laying out Preston's service record, the 2001 operation in the Balkans, the subsequent erasure from military databases. She was crisp, professional damning. Several senators took notes. Others looked uncomfortable. Then it was Matthew's turn. "The committee calls Matthew Chen." Matthew stood his legs shaky and raised his right hand to be sworn in. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do." He sat. The committee chairman, Senator Richard Gaines, peered at him over reading glasses. "Mr. Chen, you claim to have been close to Preston Fletcher in the final months of his life. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir." "And you're currently a nursing student at Metro Community College?" "Yes, sir." Gaines leaned back. "Help me understand something. You're a poor college student working multiple jobs. Preston Fletcher was homeless. What exactly did you hope to gain by befriending him?" Matthew blinked. "Gain? It's a simple question. You spent time with him, brought him food, earned his trust. Now he's dead, and you're here in Washington testifying before Congress. Some might say that's quite an upgrade for a young man in your circumstances." The implication hit Matthew like a slap. "You think I made this up to get money?" "I'm asking what your motivation was." Matthew's hands clenched under the table. He thought about the prepared statement, the advisors who'd wanted him to play victim. They'd been right about one thing: these senators didn't care about truth. They cared about politics. But Preston had cared about truth, even when it cost him everything. Matthew pulled Preston's notebook from his pocket and set it on the table. "My motivation was a peanut butter sandwich," he said. Gaines frowned. "Excuse me. Every morning I made breakfast for myself. One sandwich because that's all I could afford. And every morning I saw Preston Fletcher sitting on cardboard outside a laundromat and I gave him half." Matthew's voice steadied. "Not because I wanted something, because he was hungry and I had food. That's it." "That's a very noble story, Mr. Chen, but you want to know what I gained." Matthew cut him off. The room went silent. "I gained a friend. I gained someone who saw me as a human being in a city that treats people like me like we're invisible. Preston Fletcher shared his last sandwich with me when he knew I was starving. He told me the world needed people who cared about others. And now he's dead because this government erased him like he never mattered. Gaines's expression hardened. Mr. Chen, you're testifying before the United States Senate. And Preston Fletcher served the United States for 30 years. Matthew's voice rose. He flew into war zones. He saved lives. He kept your secrets even when keeping them cost him his home, his benefits, his dignity. He slept on cardboard in the freezing cold rather than betray classified information. And what did you do? You blacked out his records. You made him disappear. You let a hero starve on a sidewalk because it was politically convenient. The room erupted. Journalists shouted questions. Cameras swiveled toward Matthew. Senator Gaines banged his gavel. Order, I will have order. Matthew wasn't done. His hand shook, but his voice was clear. You classified his file because it was a state secret. Fine. But you can't classify the truth that you let a man who served his country die alone and forgotten. You can't black out the fact that the system failed him. You can't erase that. A senator at the far end of the bench stood up. Matthew didn't know his name, but he was older, white-haired, his face tight with emotion. The witness is right. Gaines turned. Senator Drummond. The witness is right, Drummond repeated louder. Preston Fletcher saved my life in August 2001. I was one of the senators on that convoy. I watched him pull me out of a vehicle seconds before it exploded. I owe him my life. The room went completely silent. Drummond's voice shook. And I let them bury him. I let them classify the Operation SEAL, the records make him disappear, because I was afraid of the political fallout. I've carried that shame for 23 years. He looked directly at Matthew. This young man has more courage in his testimony today than I've shown in 2 decades in this chamber. Gaines tried to regain control. Senator Drummond, this is highly irregular. Then let it be irregular. Drummond turned to the other senators. We failed Preston Fletcher. We can't bring him back. But we can make damn sure we never do this to another veteran. I'm introducing the Fletcher Act Full Protection for Classified Operatives Guaranteed Benefits Oversight to prevent erasure from the system. And I'm calling for a vote today. The hearing room exploded. Reporters rushed for the exits to file stories. Senators huddled in urgent conversation. Matthew sat frozen at the witness table, his heart pounding. In the back of the room, General Ashford caught his eye and nodded once sharp and approving. The vote came 3 hours later. The Fletcher Act passed unanimously. That evening, Matthew sat in his hotel room and watched the news coverage. Every channel showed the same clip, his face angry and defiant, his voice cracking with emotion as he confronted Senator Gaines. The Chiron read, "Student exposes veteran cover-up." His phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Carter. "We're all watching at the hospital. You did good, Matthew. Preston would be proud." Another text from a number he didn't recognize. "You spoke truth to power. Keep fighting." Dr. Patel. The news shifted to footage from St. Vincent's Hospital cafeteria. Mrs. Carter and his co-workers were crowded around a television, some crying, some cheering. The reporter's voiceover called it a story that has gripped the nation, a struggling nursing student, and the homeless hero he befriended. Matthew turned off the television. He walked to the window and looked out at Washington, at the monuments lit up against the night sky. Preston's photograph sat on the desk where Matthew had placed it. The young soldier in dress uniform, proud and whole before the system, broke him. "We did it," Matthew whispered. "Your story's out there now. They can't hide it anymore." The photograph didn't answer, but Matthew felt it anyway. That sense of rightness of a promise kept of justice, finally served. Tomorrow he'd fly home to his studio apartment and his eviction notice and his impossible schedule. But tonight, Preston Fletcher's name meant something again. Dot. And Matthew had made sure the world would remember. 6 months after the Fletcher Act passed, Matthew stood in General Ashford's Pentagon office again, but this time, everything was different. "The Preston Fletcher Memorial Fund is now operational," Ashford said, sliding a folder across her desk. "Congress allocated $12 million for the first year. Your job is to make sure it reaches the veterans who fell through the cracks the way Preston did." Matthew opened the folder. Inside were documents naming him as the fund's director, along with a salary that made his hands shake. $60,000 a year, more money than he'd ever imagined having. "I'm still finishing nursing school," Matthew said. "We know." The position is designed around that. You'll work 20 hours a week until you graduate, then transition to full-time if you want. Ashford leaned forward. But Matthew, this is important. We're not asking you to give up nursing. Preston wanted you to achieve that dream. This fund is meant to run alongside it, not replace it. Matthew looked at the documents at his name printed in official letterhead. Why me? There are people with more experience, more. Because you see them. Ashford interrupted. You saw Preston when everyone else walked past. That's what these veterans need, someone who recognizes their humanity before their paperwork. Matthew accepted the position that afternoon. The first thing he did was find a new apartment. Not luxury, nothing extravagant, but a one-bedroom with windows that actually let in sunlight. The day he moved in, he stood in the empty living room and felt the warmth on his face, and something tight in his chest finally loosened. He kept his hospital cafeteria job for another month before Mrs. Carter pulled him aside. "You're doing important work now," she said. "We'll miss you, but go help those veterans." Matthew's schedule shifted, but his habits didn't. He still woke at 5 a.m., but now it was to prepare for a day of reviewing veteran applications, connecting people with housing resources, cutting through red tape that had strangled men like Preston. He finished his nursing degree at night, graduated with honors, and started working part-time at St. Vincent's while running the fund. The work was exhausting and necessary. Every week brought new cases, veterans with sealed records disappeared, benefits bureaucratic nightmares that had pushed them onto the streets. Matthew fought for each one with the same fierce determination he'd shown in the Senate hearing. In the first year alone, the fund helped 847 veterans. On a cold November morning, exactly 1 year after Preston's death, Matthew drove to Arlington National Cemetery. The burial had taken place 3 months after the Senate hearing, once Preston's service record was officially unsealed and his status confirmed. Full military honors, a flag-draped coffin, a 3-volley salute. General Ashford had personally ensured Preston Fletcher received every tribute he'd been denied in life. Matthew walked through rows of white headstones until he found the right one. Preston Allen Fletcher, March 15, 1954, September 28, 2025, Major United States Army, Defense Intelligence Agency, faithful unto death. Matthew knelt and placed a thermos of black coffee on the grass in front of the headstone. Steam rose from the lid in the cold air. "I kept my promise, Preston," Matthew said quietly. "The fund's helping people, real people, not just numbers in a system. And I'm a nurse now, working in the same hospital where you—" his voice caught, "where you taught me what it means to fight for what's right." The cemetery was silent, except for wind moving through the trees. "I wish you could see what your story changed. The Fletcher Act has helped thousands of veterans. Your name means something now. It means honor. It means sacrifice. It means the system can't just erase people anymore." Matthew stood, his hand resting on the cold marble. "Thank you for seeing me, for sharing your breakfast even when you had nothing, for trusting me with your truth." He stepped back. "Rest easy. I've got it from here." The next morning, Matthew returned to his routine. 5 a.m. wake-up coffee breakfast. But instead of heading straight to work, he stopped at the old laundromat. The cardboard was gone now. The spot where Preston used to sit was just empty sidewalk. But the bus stop was still there, and so were the people waiting. One of them sat apart from the others, a young woman, maybe 30, with the hollow-eyed look Matthew recognized. Military bearing despite the worn jacket, hands that trembled slightly. The signs of someone fighting battles no one else could see. Matthew walked over. The woman looked up defensive. "Morning," Matthew said. "I'm Matthew." "Sarah," she said cautiously. "I made too much breakfast this morning. Would you help me out by taking some?" Matthew held out a brown paper bag. Inside was a sandwich, an apple, and a banana. Sarah stared at the bag like it might disappear. "Why?" "Because someone did the same for me once, and it saved my life." Sarah took the bag slowly. Her hands shook as she opened it. "I work for the Preston Fletcher Memorial Fund," Matthew said, pulling out a business card. "We help veterans who are struggling. Housing, benefits, medical care, whatever you need. If you're interested, give me a call." Sarah looked at the card, then at Matthew. "I'm not looking for charity." "Neither was I. But sometimes accepting help is the bravest thing you can do." Matthew stepped back toward the bus stop. "The offer stands. Whenever you're ready." The bus 47 pulled up. Matthew started to board, then looked back. For just a moment, he saw Preston standing in the morning mist behind Sarah, his face younger, healthier, whole. Preston smiled and tipped an invisible hat in a gesture of respect and acknowledgement. Then he faded into the sunlight, and Matthew knew. Preston wasn't gone. He lived in every veteran the fund helped, every act of kindness passed forward, every person who refused to let the system crush someone's dignity. Matthew climbed onto the bus and found his seat. He pulled out his nursing textbook, Advanced Cardiac Care, this semester, and opened it on his lap. Next to it sat Preston's old notebook, which Matthew still carried everywhere. On the first page in Preston's careful handwriting was something Matthew had discovered months after the funeral. Justice isn't something we find. It's something we create through small acts of courage when no one is watching. Matthew looked out the window as the bus pulled away from the stop. Sarah was opening the sandwich, eating slowly, carefully. She was reading his business card. The cycle continued. The kindness passed forward. The legacy lived on. Matthew understood now what Preston had been trying to teach him all along. You couldn't fix the whole system. You couldn't save everyone. But you could see the person right in front of you. You could share your sandwich. You could refuse to let them be invisible. Justice wasn't a grand gesture. It was a thermos of coffee on a cold morning. It was splitting a peanut butter sandwich when you were both starving. It was recognizing someone's humanity when the world had decided they didn't matter. The bus carried Matthew toward another day of work, of helping, of fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. He was tired. He was always tired, but it was a different kind of exhaustion now. Not the desperate scramble of survival, but the purposeful weariness of meaningful work. Preston Fletcher had been erased by the powerful and redeemed by a struggling nursing student with a peanut butter sandwich. His story had exposed a broken system and changed it. But more than that, Preston had changed Matthew, had shown him that dignity wasn't something you could lose as long as someone was willing to see it in you. The bus rolled through the waking city, and Matthew smiled. Justice wasn't something you found waiting for you. It was something you fought for, protected, created one small act at a time.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.